Hey guys, um, David McMurdo just yesterday, I would say at this time, I watched it yesterday, but I just finished watching it again to make sure um, I had all those points still in my head. He made a video about the Gospel of John, some thoughts on textual criticism, and first off, this is not like a refutation video or anything like that. Um, I think he basically worded it as best as you can if you hold to that kind of position. And what I wanted to do is actually take the opportunity to explore what he said, the ideas and how I dealt with them when I came upon this subject, and tell you a little bit about how I reached the opinion I did on John. And so, once again, this is not like a refutation or anything. He's actually, I think, it's boiled down to those three main points. The three main points of his video at the end of the day is you have um, the literal historical view of John, aka everything John said was like, you know, true for best intents and purposes. It actually happened. The second is a more poetic view, um, which is the discussions in John didn't actually happen, but were meant to take some kind of spiritual meaning from them. And the third one, which is more of an afterthought, was kind of First John authorship, and what do you do with that as well. The first thing we'll spend a lot of time on, I'll come out and say it out front, is I've not um, turned the critical guns on First John. I've done some preliminary reading, and all I'll say about that is it seems you could go one or two ways with that. Apparently, the participles and the things that he uses in the Greek are different from the gospel. So, maybe they did, maybe they didn't. I don't know. But I'm not really going to spend much time on that because I haven't really started to look at that. So, the first thing I'll start off is to just kind of talk about the personal aspect of this. When I came across, it wasn't something I was actively looking to do. Okay, it's kind of like the Trinity thing. I wasn't actively looking to disprove the Trinity, and I wasn't actively looking at John in any particular way. I was trying to reconcile, um, and I guess maybe I'm different than some people. I just noticed contradictions within the text. And the more I tried to figure out how these things went together, the more I saw this is a problem. It dawned on me that the one view that I thought was impossible was the one that started to manifest itself. And I really didn't know how to put it into words until I had read other scholarship on it and figured out what most likely was the case as best as I could understand it. And when it dawned on me, it wasn't like, I wasn't like, yeah, I caught you, John. I was just kind of like, okay. So what does this mean? You go through that phase where you have to reassess where you're at and all this other stuff. So, that's the first thing I would say. It's not a decision that I reached because I was trying to disprove John. But it became clear to me as I studied more and more that I found myself as a Unitarian, and I will use some phrases in this video that I'm not applying them to other people, even if I say it in a way that's general. Words like honest with ourselves or dishonest with ourselves, because these were the things that I had to face. This is how I felt. And the view that started to emerge for me is I found as a Unitarian reading the Gospel of John, I found myself doing the same things Trinitarians do, and that was switching my hermeneutic as I read the book. I had to, and it makes sense to me now because John's Gospel switches its hermeneutic. It contradicts itself, and you start to see multiple manifestations of the same idea, but they come out differently. And the pre-existent view was actually the easiest one to see in the text. You know, think about it this way. John chapter 1, there's several views, and I don't want to mention anyone else by name or anything, but I think one person in particular, out of all the videos I've seen, one person did figure out there's a problem with the word pros. Okay, and many Unitarians, they don't deal with that, but there are some that do. And I keyed in on this too when I started looking at it. You know, this word was a different person or thing, or, you know, whatever you want to attribute it to be. But when it talks about creation, and I don't want to spend too much time on the Greek, but when it uses the word dia, and then you have the hutos after that, it denotes a him. You know, it does. That's how the text should be translated. And I think one person in particular figured this out and tried to deal with it. You know, ultimately I wasn't convinced, obviously, but it was the first thing I noticed. So we take John a certain way, and then before Abraham I am passage, we take a different way. And we get to John chapter 10, we take that literal. And then when you get to doubting Thomas, you know what I mean? We get this succession of kind of, you know, the glory I had with you before the cosmos, you know. And yeah, I've heard the glory and prospect, and then the glory as a plan, but there's also, you know, the possibility that it was saying the actual glory I had before the cosmos existed. And I noticed that in that sense, we kind of acted like Calvinists. We started playing with the word cosmos and drawing these different meanings out of it. You have 316 as one kind of cosmos, you know, before heaven and earth and all that's another one. So this view started to emerge for me. So the first thing I started to ask myself, I said, well, let's start assembling the facts, okay? Now, the first thing I'll point out, just to spend a little bit of time on it, John, the one thing I know is that John, he probably could, I mean, highly probably could not read or write. And you will find that in Acts chapter 4:13. Now, as they observed the confidence of Peter and John and understood that they were uneducated and untrained men, they were amazed and began to recognize them as having been with Jesus. And some people would try to take this term for uneducated and say it meant they weren't familiar with the Jewish ways or synagogue teaching. I don't think that's right because of the word they use next. But so this word agrammatos, okay, is where we get our word grammar. It means uneducated, unlettered, illiterate, uneducated, perhaps with a narrower idea, unacquainted with rabbinic teaching. And it's only used once, Acts 4:13, and they use the connotation illiterate without learning. And the people that push that the narrower idea, the problem is the word that comes after it, and it's the word trained, and idiotas, and it means an amateur, an unprofessional, a layman, and an ungifted person. It says properly of oneself, used as who is conspicuously lacks education or status, hence easily misunderstood and as being uninstructed, unrefined, unlettered in speech. And it's translated 5 times as ungifted, ungifted man, ungifted men, unskilled, and untrained. And it's used, it's actually a very common word in Greek, and it's opposed to the learned and educated, unlearned, illiterate man, Acts 4:13. So, you know, I think that was the first thing I just came to accept is John didn't write anything, okay? No matter what we want to say about it, John didn't write anything. And, you know, as far as the Gospels themselves, we just kind of plug these names to them anyway. But when you look at John in particular, like I said, the last chapter, there's a we. They know that's not original. It's pretty safe to say that John 1 is an original because you can look at the structure of it even. And that's a hymn that they found So there's just too much. If I had to guess, there's at least, I know for a fact they've been able to demonstrate that there's two, because of the difference in the languages, and there seems to be a more common speculation of three. Three people have actively written parts of John, and that's not counting any editors. And I can swear on my grave that I'm pretty sure Irenaeus was one of those people. Irenaeus was in love with the Gospel of John, and he was determined not to let the Gnostics have it. But I don't want to go down the Gnostic road just yet. So I want to speak to the first point, the literal view of John. To me, that is theological suicide. You would just absolutely get crushed by the weight of facts, and you're going to have to disqualify one of these books. And let us keep in mind, a lot of people like to look at the synoptics and use phrases like crude. Luke's Greek was far from crude. It was written for the metropolitan type crowd. And remember, Luke's supposed to be a historian. And now what you have is John actually given a case that is so much more accurate than Luke could ever hope to. And it just doesn't make any sense. So I just utterly reject the literal case out of hand. And I notice people like to weave in and out of it. They like to treat John a certain way, but then acknowledge he's not. The other case is the odder one to me. And that's the view that most people seem to hold without even realizing it. And that is this poetic form of John. The more I started to think about that and try to reconcile that, the more it seemed crazy. We have to sit there for a second. It was Paul himself who said, "Do we do evil so good may come?" Lying is evil. Putting words in Jesus' mouth is lying. And I don't know why all of a sudden the rules change when we get to John. It's because it's what we've inherited. Just like the book of Jeremiah says, you've inherited the pen of the lying scribes. That to me became a fundamental problem. Fundamental. As a Christian, I have a book in my Bible that even if I believe in it, I'm willing to admit Jesus probably didn't say any of this stuff. But now I'm telling you to believe it still. It's just contradictory. And like I said, I've already covered a lot of the problems. The Passover, the length of the ministry is a huge problem. It actually, and I'll try to convey this because it's complicated. But if John is correct, it seems like it actually moves the year of the crucifixion. A lot of people don't stop to think about that, but the way the days fall, the year would have to move. So that's another issue. But here I am with this book now. So I'm trying to, and then, I started looking back on it. I said, okay, John, lately we've been having this eschatology debate about the end. And you have Trinitarians, love that book. Pentecostals love that book. Jehovah's Witnesses love that book. Unitarians, I'll be honest with you, the unit from Anthony Buzzard to the One God, One Lord book by the Unitarian Church people, no one convinces me on John 1 at all. It seems like we're contorting to try and make this book say something. And that's what I figured about John. That's what I figured out about it, is everyone loves that book because you can make it say anything you want. And at first you may let this point bounce off of you, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke as accounts, let's be honest, first of all, if this was a court case and you called in those 4 witnesses, you would throw John out. Hands down. There'd be no argument. You'd accuse him of being a liar. And like I said, I will come out and say that. I don't care who it is. If you're putting words in Jesus' mouth, I have a problem with you. I don't care if he was a disciple or not. That's just not cool. And there's this misconception. This is another thing. People act like it's not a big deal. If John did in fact put words in Jesus, well, let's be honest, he did. It's the writer of John speaking. You notice Jesus, John the Baptist, and the narrator all sound exactly the same. You're hearing his testimony, whatever that may be. But we turn off our, and I guess that's what it strikes me as now. It strikes me just as dishonest to even defend this book, because we're supposed to be the truth, the proclaimers of truth, and this and that and the other. And then I'm sitting here and I'm reading a book that I know is full of words he didn't say. To me, that strikes me as dangerous, at this point. But when you look at it, John it becomes this big theological book now. And that's why. It's because you can make it say whatever you want. And when you compare it to synoptics, see, the synoptics have one distinct advantage, is that they fit into the parallels of normative Judaism. And if you've never read the Midrash, I'm telling you right now, I mean, me personally, I think Jesus either broke from an Essene community or was trained as a Pharisee in some way. He sounds exactly like a rabbi. I mean, exactly. That's not what you have in John, and that's how I know it's not the same person. It's literally not the same person. I mean, to me, it does fit that definition. John is preaching a different Christ, and I can't defend that. I can't, you know, but getting back to the other point is that in this eschatology debate and everything that's coming up right now, people go run straight to John. And it's because you can make him say whatever you want. And I will come out and make this point, and it's going to sound firm, maybe a little bit harsh, but it needs to be said. I've watched every video within this community and outside of this community about John in particular, especially when I started to go through this and started seeing the cracks in the road. And I'm going to tell you right now, what I have learned about the Johannine community or the Johannine community, nobody, and I say this just to be honest, not to insult anybody, but nobody has a clue what John actually meant, because nobody even understands the Johannine community. Nobody. And I mean that. And it's something that people need to be honest about. These guys were Essenes. Even Josephus points out John the Baptist as being an Essene. There's so much more to it. Read some Rick Eiserman. There's people. The Dead Sea Scrolls have given up a lot of the ghosts on this. The language that was used between the Gospel of John and the light and dark, the dualism, these kind of things that are in John are in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what they know about that community is they were some form of Essene. And like I said, Essene is a blanket term. And they could have been in several different beliefs, is what I'm saying. And when you stop to look at them, when you stop to look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, and scholarship has been really slow on this, which makes me very suspicious, I might add. A lot of these details are really hard to get. But their language is almost identical, and their theologies are almost identical. And what you got to know about the Essenes in general, most of them, they were probably associated with the Pythagoreans as well. They both liked to wear their white robes and were vegetarians and sexual purity. If you had a wet dream, you had to wash the next morning, all kinds of stuff. Because they were waiting for the angels to come so they could destroy all the people in Jerusalem and drive out the Romans and all this other stuff and kill anyone who was unjust. And the Johannine community has reflections of that. But let me just stress that one more time. Nobody knows, nobody even, everybody's saying what John means. And they'll say things like the John community, the Johannine community, but it's evident in the way that they talk. And I say this not to be rude, but it's I can tell immediately with the small amount that I know about the Johannine community, that none of you know about the Johannine community. They were a separate community unto themselves. People were very suspicious of them. We also know that many of them worshiped John the Baptist as the Christ, not Jesus. These churches are still around to these days. They still exist. And when you look at the Mandeans and later the Cathars, these other groups came around and they had these leanings, and they came from somewhere. They came from the Johannine community. The other group of them became Valentinians. Okay? They became Valentinian Gnostics. And yes, some did end up being more orthodox in the end. But we know they had these leanings already. But like I said, for all these people to sit here and tell me what John meant, and then when I hear him talk, John was not, and I say John, I mean the writer, because it wasn't John. I'm positive about that. And neither did he write Revelations. Possibly the same author of First John and Gospel of John is possible, but there are good Greek grammatical arguments to say otherwise. But this community, this guy, whoever wrote this, and then the editors, and that's my suspicion. My suspicion is either one, it was about John the Baptist, and they went in there and toiled with the text to make it about Jesus. Two, it could have been about Jesus, and they still went in there and toiled to make it more orthodox. And you know that John does not fit normative Judaism at all. And I don't think people understand, and I don't think that they respect the fact to have Jesus saying, "Eat my flesh and drink my blood," would have rightfully driven any Jew over the edge. They're just things that Jews wouldn't say. And there are many serious problems with this concept, you know. You look at his first miracle, the wine, you know, that's a lot like Dionysus. It's almost an exact match. And, you know, you do know that in Jewish culture, you go to the groom, the parents of the groom. Jesus, it wasn't Jesus's place to make wine, and it wasn't their place to ask Mary. So the cultural stuff is just all wrong. And it's just these, you know, it's just when you really stop to think. I mean, like I said, if you've never read about the Johannine community, you really can't tell me what John meant, because you don't understand anything about them. And once again, I don't say that to be facetious or put anyone down. It's just a blatant fact that if you don't study this community, because we can only know so much about it at that. I don't know exactly all what they meant, and they came in their own flavors too. And you got to remember the Valentinians, Heraclon, and what was his name? Not Theodotus. I don't think Dophacy. There was two people. The first two commentaries that were ever written on John were from the Valentinian community, which strikes me as odd. Polycarp, the student of John, most scholars say 0, but it seems the best argument you can make is that Polycarp quoted the Gospel of John once, and that's highly contested. And you have no church fathers in the first century quoting it. So there's something funny going on about this whole thing. And like I said, the Johannine community, when he wrote First John, it wasn't to the Christian community. It was to the Johannine community to deal with their specific problems and their specific understanding. And they were a separatist community. They seemed to not mix well with other people unless they gave up their beliefs. Furthermore, you take a look at Irenaeus. Irenaeus says we have to have 4 gospels because there's 4 winds and animals have 4 legs, and it's ridiculous. But one of the interesting notes about Irenaeus when he's making some criticisms is he points out the Valentinians are in error because they only use the Gospel of John. I think that reveals a lot. If you read John by itself, you get to see it for what it is. And it doesn't strike me as good that you need 3 other Gospels to hold John in check, which it's failed miserably anyway, because look at the conclusions people have reached anyway. So you take these arguments now, And then what am I supposed to do? You know, I would say in all honesty, if you hold the position that John is poetry, that it's somebody saying something about Jesus, you know, how can you build any theology on anything in John? I mean, how easy is that to refute? You're telling me this, you know, and I've gone to make a place for you, and I will come. Well, he never even said it, so how does that become a backbone of theology? And once again, I cannot stress enough for people to at least understand. When you put words in someone's mouth, you are a liar. Why? You would not accept this in any other format but John, because it's been handed to you. And now you've opened up a curious door to me if you're honest with yourself. Because, see these two books right here? You know what they both have in common? They too put words in Jesus' mouth. So why reject them? Some of these books were accepted. And as far as the canon goes, and saying, well, you know, you can't throw anything on a can. Well, first of all, God never told nobody to make no Bible. Number one. Number two, the canon you have right now in your hand is the smallest canon that's ever existed. Think about that. Let that set in for a minute. Your Protestant canon is the smallest canon that has ever existed. So, till the what, 1700s, y'all just didn't have the real canon. And remember, oldest Bible ever found. You've been lied to, my friends. But besides that, getting back to John, like I said, how can you even use John in a theological debate when the easiest answer to dismiss any argument is to say he never said it? How does that make any sense? And you know, you can even I figured I'd do this just for crafts and giggles, but you can even look at the wiki page on this. And even they're going to tell you that it was probably between 90 and 110. You know, and that's another thing. You know, people want to cling to any kind of tradition about John. Tradition says that book is much older. So it's kind of like this picking and choosing thing. But, you know, I guess that would be the biggest point, is in what context would it ever be okay to lie as a Christian like that? How can that sit right with anyone? That Jesus didn't say anything in that book, yet it's still true. To me, it just seems like a dangerous game to play. And when you look at somebody like Paul, Paul never met Jesus. And he talks like that. He talks like he didn't meet Jesus. And he says a lot of stuff about Jesus, and he openly speculates about things with Jesus sometimes. You got to read John honestly. John does not present himself as poetry. He absolutely does not. And, you know, David said his thing is literature. Okay? And my question to you, David, would be, when you read John, are you just presupposing that that's poetry? How does John present himself? He presents himself as a series of factual events and factual discussions. He doesn't present himself as poetry. He's very literal. And then, you know, some will say, well, I put him in between. What does that even mean? I don't even understand what that means. He's in between literal historical account and poetry? That just doesn't make any sense to me. He can't stand up literally because the synoptics destroy it. And then the character, like I said, he presents himself as this is the gospel. This is what happened. This is the truth. And let me read something to you at the end here. Just to drive a point home. because I don't think there's one thing I think people are not doing. They are not letting John speak for himself at all. At all. So when we go to the book of John, go to chapter 21. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who has leaned back against him during the supper and had said, Lord, who is it that's going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about this man? Jesus said to him, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. So the saying spread abroad among the brothers that the disciple was not to die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he was not to die. If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? And this is probably when Lazarus died. Probably. The disciple who is bearing witness about these things and who has written these things, and we know his testimony is true. Let that sink in. This disciple, you're going to say it has to be John, this disciple who is bearing witness about these things and who has written these things. And we know that his testimony is true. That's a lie. It's a bold-faced lie. His testimony is not true. Even by everyone else's admission that it's poetry. And I guess that's the thing to me, and this is why I'm going to use that word. You know, some self-dishonesty is going on. It's John does not present himself as a book of poetry. He doesn't at all. He really doesn't. And I would say that's the most important thing is let John speak for himself. John, I mean, he said Jesus went to 3 Passovers. And he gives a theological teaching at each Passover. He's making a point. That's not poetry. He's telling you this happened. And I feel like I'm in Trinitarian land sometimes. I just refuse to give anything that's dishonest a pass. And, you know, I look at the synoptics and I'm working my way through those, trying to figure out what are actual contradictions and, you know, stuff like that, and the synoptic problem and the four-source theory. And so, you know, even those theories allow for a certain variance because they're drawing on material from Mark, who appears, 90% of his book appears verbatim in the other Gospels, and that's how they know the synoptic problem exists. No one does that. There's no such thing as people who write exactly the same. But they drew material. You know, Luke would have spoke to different people about Jesus. So there are things to me that they're believable. They can be worked out. John is coming from a singular source. It's supposed to be the apostle himself who witnessed the transfiguration. It says nothing about it. And like I said, some of the problems with John are so severe they had to invent what they call the signs gospel. Because they're trying to figure, they know between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, these sign miracles, they didn't happen. So they had to come up with a whole nother source. Now, why does John need a source? It doesn't make any sense. John doesn't need a source. He was there. He was the person. This was a community that lived out on its own, that was not really part of normative Judaism. Probably was a scene in its nature. It seems the gospel was first used by Gnostics. The first commentaries on it were written by Gnostics. Irenaeus was in love with it because God became a man. Think about that. That's why he loved the book so much. God became man so man could become God. That's where he got it from. The contradicting theologies within John, saying none of them know God, and then saying Moses knew God, and then you know, look at the Samaritan woman. I don't think people even pay that any mind. That's a real problem. He specifically says in the Synoptics to not speak to the Samaritans. And here you got John putting Jesus hanging out with a Samaritan? He goes against his own word. You know what I mean? What am I supposed to do with Jesus then? When he says things and then he goes against his own word. And here's something you might want to know about the Samaritans. I said in the earlier video, and some of you may or may not have seen it, the concept of Messiah was developed in Midrash. Okay? You have to let the book actually says what it says. They developed the idea of a Messiah outside of the Bible and read it back into the Bible. It was something for study. Okay, the word Messiah is not even used of this person who's coming. Now, the Samaritans had the books of Moses and some others, but they were outside of normative Judaism. And it's come to be the most widely held position by the Samaritans is that they had no concept of a Messiah because it was developed in Midrash, the oral tradition of normative Judaism, which no Jew would speak to them because they were filthy. So now you got this woman at the well talking about a Messiah. It's commonly believed by most scholars that they had no concept of a Messiah. So it's an odd statement of itself. And you get these relations to Gnostic writings with her 5 husbands and, Helena and all this other stuff. The rabbit hole on John is deep, man. But those would be the biggest points I would leave you with. How do you use John in a theological argument when all the person has to do is say, well, Jesus never actually said that? 2, how are you going to use John in an argument if you don't know anything about the Johannine community? And I hate to keep dwelling on it, but it's something people need to understand and need to admit. If you don't know nothing about the Johannine community or the Johannine community, you're not going to get it right. You're just saying what you want it to say. 3, I don't think it's a good enough excuse in my mind anymore to say John is some kind of poetic license. Because no matter what you want to say about it, he doesn't present himself that way. That's you doing that. And that's one thing I think people need to do is they need to read the books for what they say. And there's a lot of that. He said, I was guilty of it. I was trying to make John say this and that. And I've seen some elaborate stuff. And I've seen some really smart people make videos that make absolutely no sense. I've been bewildered by some of these videos on John that I've seen by people I respect. And I'm not saying anyone's, I'm not insulting anybody. I'm just telling you. It's like you're just blatantly reading this stuff into the text. It's not there. It doesn't literally say that. And I thought that was the big beef with the Trinity. You can't read into the text. John is not poetry. The only people saying it's poetry are people who know that there's a problem. And this is how they get around it. And again, you want books like that? There you go. Look at all that. That's all people that put words in Jesus' mouth. And some of these were held true by early churches. So why not? Let's go back and get these now. Let's go recover the truth. No, you'll reject those books. And I'm going to tell you, the only reason you reject those books is because you were told to. I mean, that's the truth, isn't it? What grounds do you have now? Now that you look at John this way, anyone can do it. And I'm going to tell you, in ancient culture, that was not okay. And as a Christian, it should be doubly not okay to put words in Jesus' mouth. That's a big deal. And it's kind of weird how nonchalant that's become. Maybe he said it, maybe he didn't. You know what I mean? Maybe he did say it, maybe he didn't say it. We don't know, but we're going to use it anyway. I want to know what Jesus actually said. I don't want John's opinion. I want to know what was actually said. How can I follow the words of my teacher if I don't have them? And like I said, you look at the transfiguration missing. John was there. Apparently, these people didn't know about the transfiguration. That's what really happened. They didn't know. All these events where John was present, they're not recorded in the gospel. It just blows my mind. You're going to tell me that this guy is 3 times, he's got a 3-year ministry. So basically, it's 3 times more accurate than any other gospel. And he leaves out more material and comes up with this stuff. And he was at some of these events that would have been life altering. You never would have been the same. I just won't believe you if you're going to tell me John left it out the gospel. I will literally not believe you. None of the men ever lived to see an event like that again. So, how can you use John in an apologetic at this point? How can you? Because now you're just arguing over what someone thought. And that someone was not John the Apostle. So we're arguing over what someone thought about Jesus by this person invented a story about Jesus that never happened. And you're going to try and translate that and use it against me in an apologetic. It doesn't hold up. I thought our standard for truth was supposed to be high. That's what led me to this problem with John is if it doesn't make sense, it don't make sense. And it needs to be accepted that it doesn't make sense. So this video's definitely been long enough. But John, watch David's video. It was very good. As far as that position goes, that's about as well as you can say it. It really doesn't even matter how much you study the issue. That's the only two options you got. And one, historical view, it's suicide. You'll never harmonize it with the synoptics. It's impossible. Two, you take the poetry view, what you're doing by default is just saying it's okay that this person stuck all these words in Jesus's mouth. Not just a few. You're talking an entire book of stuff he never said. You got Jesus hating his own people. That's a shame. The Jews, that's a shame. You got Jesus being confrontational with God's law. Your law. Like he's separated from that. Like that law's not his. And I would just hope this makes people stop and think about it at least. Just say, you know what, there are some valid points there. There's something I got to deal with. But like I said, either you got, I just don't understand. I don't understand how you could use it in an apologetic and think of it in the poetic way. That I don't understand. Because that's how I would shoot you down. I just say, well, you and I both know he never said it. And you're just saying this is what the Johannines thought. And if you've never studied the Johannines, it will show. It will definitely show when you speak about the Johannine community. And like I said, it's mystic. I don't know everything about it. I don't. But what I do understand about it, that's how I know a lot of these views that people put forth on it are just not possible. And that's another thing. Scholarship over the last 50 years has come a long way on the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Johannine community. We know more than we did. And it's getting harder and harder to really justify it anyway. So if you were studying this 30 years ago, you're way behind. You are way behind. You don't know what they know now unless you keep up with it. And it's pretty clear the Johannine community was its own community. It was separate from everyone else. And the way people talk about it, it's like it wasn't intermingled with the other communities. It was its own thing. And it died at the beginning of the 2nd century. That's when it literally kind of dispersed. And I would say, personally, it was because the end didn't come. That's what these people were waiting for. And it got harder and harder to keep them there. So, but that's my 2 cents on it. David made a very good video. And like I said, this is really not about trying to refute David's points. I'm just telling you, those were the same points I came to. You're left with these two views. And I tried to look at them objectively and say, well, how could I even justify this any longer? How could I go on saying this? Does this make any sense? And for me, the answer was no. So, God bless.